You think you know the people who raised you. You grow up believing that no matter how cold, how distant, or how critical they might be, there is a boundary they will never cross. There is a baseline of human decency, a protective instinct that everyone possesses when it comes to an innocent child. I used to believe that. I spent years making excuses for my parents, telling myself that their harshness was just their way of showing a tough kind of love. But a person's true nature doesn't reveal itself when things are easy. It shows when the pressure is on, when the storm arrives, and when they think no one is watching. That was the day I realized my parents weren't just cold. They were monsters. And they forgot one very important thing. They forgot exactly who they were dealing with. They forgot about the years I spent overseas, the training that broke me down and rebuilt me into someone who doesn't flinch, someone who doesn't hesitate, and someone who protects the innocent at all costs. Let me take you back to that afternoon. It started out like any other rainy Tuesday, but the air felt heavy. The sky over our small town had turned an unnatural, bruised shade of purple and black. The local news channels were already flashing severe weather warnings across the screen. High winds, torrential downpours, and flash flood alerts were popping up every few minutes. I was standing in the kitchen of my own home, packing a small duffel bag. My name is Maya. For the last 8 years, my life had been defined by discipline, structure, and survival. I was a sergeant in the military, trained to handle high-stress environments, logistics, and emergency response. When you spend that much time in uniform, you don't just leave the mindset behind when you take the boots off. You look at the world differently. You scan for exits. You notice small shifts in people's behavior.
You prepare for the worst-case scenario. And that day, the worst-case scenario was knocking on my door, but it wasn't the weather. It was an emergency deployment order. My unit was being called up to assist with a massive disaster relief operation 2 states over. It was short notice, the kind of call that leaves your stomach in knots because you have to drop everything instantly. Normally, this wouldn't be an issue. But I wasn't just a soldier anymore. I was a mother. My daughter Lily was 8 years old. She was my absolute world, a bright, smiling little girl with eyes full of wonder, completely untouched by the harsh realities of the world I had seen. Her father had passed away when she was just a baby, leaving me as her sole protector. With the deployment order ticking down, I had exactly 2 hours to find someone to watch Lily for the next 4 days. My usual babysitter was out of town, and my closest friends were already dealing with their own families prepping for the incoming storm. I felt a rising sense of panic, a tightening in my chest that I rarely allowed myself to feel. I looked down at my phone, staring at the names in my contacts. There were only 2 people left to call, and every instinct in my body told me to avoid them. My parents, Richard and Eleanor. Our relationship had been strained for a decade. They never approved of my choice to join the military. They wanted a daughter who would stay in our hometown, marry a wealthy man from their social circle, and live a quiet, compliant life that they could control. When I chose my own path, they viewed it as a personal insult. They distanced themselves, only reaching out when they wanted to criticize my parenting or remind me of how much better off I would have been if I had listened to them. But looking out the window at the darkening sky, hearing the wind begin to howl against the glass, I swallowed my pride. This wasn't about my ego. This was about Lily's safety. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother's number. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice level, using the disciplined tone I used under pressure. "I need a favor. It's an emergency." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a heavy, dramatic sigh. "Maya, it's always an emergency with you. What is it now?" "We are very busy preparing our estate for the storm. My unit got called up for a disaster response. I have to report to the base in 2 hours. I need you and Dad to watch Lily until Friday. Please." "There is no one else." Another pause. I could hear her muffled voice speaking to my father in the background. My heart was pounding. I hated asking them for anything, hated giving them any leverage over my life. Finally, my mother came back on the line. "Fine. Bring her over. But make it quick. We don't want to be driving in this weather, and frankly, you should have planned better." "Thank you," I said, ignoring the sting of her words. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I packed Lily's favorite pink backpack with her clothes, her favorite books, and her stuffed bear Barnaby. I knelt down in front of her, looking into her innocent eyes. I put my hands on her small shoulders, offering her the calmest, most reassuring smile I could muster. "Hey sweetie," I said softly. "Mommy has to go help some people for a few days. You're going to stay with Grandma and Grandpa. I need you to be a brave little soldier for me, okay? Listen to them, stay inside, and I'll be back before you know it." Lily nodded, clutching her bear tightly. "I will, Mommy. I'll be brave." I strapped her into the back of my truck and drove through the sheets of rain toward my parents' house. They lived in a large, isolated home on the edge of town, surrounded by acres of private woods and a long, winding gravel driveway. It was a beautiful property, but it always felt cold to me, like a museum rather than a home. As I pulled up, the wind was tearing leaves from the trees, and the sky had grown completely dark, lit only by the occasional flash of distant lightning. My father opened the heavy wooden front door, looking at me with a stern, unreadable expression. He didn't offer a hug, didn't ask how I was doing. He just stepped aside to let Lily in. "She has everything she needs in her bag," I said, handing the backpack to my mother, who stood in the foyer with her arms crossed. "The emergency numbers are on the side pocket. The storm is supposed to get bad tonight, so please just keep her safe, keep her inside, and don't go anywhere." "We know how to manage a household, Maya," my father muttered coldly. "You just go do whatever it is you do. We'll handle the child." I bent down, gave Lily one last tight hug, whispering in her ear that I loved her. As I walked back out into the pouring rain, a strange, sickening feeling washed over me. It was that gut instinct, the internal alarm bell that keeps a soldier alive in the field. Every tactical bone in my body was telling me to turn around, to grab my daughter, and to drive away. But I looked at my uniform, thought of my duty, and forced myself to get into the truck. I told myself I was being paranoid. They were her grandparents. Surely, beneath all their coldness, they loved her. They wouldn't let anything happen to her. I was completely wrong. They were about to do the unthinkable. And that decision would change all of our lives forever. The drive to the military base was treacherous. The roads were already beginning to flood, and the wind was pushing my heavy truck across the asphalt. My mind was divided. Half of me was focusing on the upcoming mission, mentally reviewing the standard operating procedures for flood rescue and civilian evacuation. The other half was locked on that grand, isolated house in the woods where my daughter was staying. I kept checking my rearview mirror, watching the town disappear into a wall of gray water and mist. When I arrived at the staging area, it was absolute chaos. Hundreds of soldiers were moving in every direction, loading supplies onto heavy transport vehicles, checking communication gear, and preparing for a long, grueling weekend. The atmosphere was tense. We knew the storm was a Category 4 system, and it was stalling directly over our region. That meant the rainfall wouldn't stop for days. Rivers would overflow, power grids would fail, and thousands of people would be stranded. "Sergeant Miller," my commanding officer yelled over the roar of a generator. "Get your team assigned to Sector 4. We're moving out in 10 minutes. Communication lines are already starting to drop, so rely on your satellite radios. Let's move." "Yes, sir," I shouted back. I forced my personal worries into a dark corner of my mind. In the military, compartmentalization is a survival skill. If you worry about home while you're in the zone, people get hurt. You have to be fully present. I checked my gear, rallied my squad, and climbed into the back of a massive, high-water tactical vehicle. For the first 12 hours, the work was nonstop. We were navigating through chest-deep water, pulling elderly couples from the roofs of their cars, clearing fallen trees from blocked roads, and setting up emergency shelters in local school gymnasiums. The rain was relentless, stinging our faces like needles. The sound of the wind was a constant, deafening roar. My hands were raw, my uniform soaked through, but the adrenaline kept me going. Every time I looked at a scared child being wrapped in a warm blanket by our medics, I thought of Lily. I took comfort in the fact that she was safe in a massive, brick home with a backup generator, far away from the rising floodwaters. But by 3 a.m., a strange shift occurred. The weather patterns altered, and the center of the storm shifted directly toward the northern ridge, the exact area where my parents' house was located. During a brief 5-minute rest break, I pulled out my military-issue satellite phone. Standard cell towers were completely dead across the county, but my tech could pierce through the interference. I dialed my parents' landline. No answer. I dialed my mother's cell phone. It went straight to an automated message. I dialed my father's phone. Nothing. A cold knot began to form in my stomach. A power outage was expected, but my parents had a top-of-the-line, automated generator that kept their landline and internet active during any storm. They prided themselves on never being inconvenienced by external factors. Why weren't they picking up? Hey Miller, one of my squad mates, a tech specialist named Harris, said as he handed me a bottle of water. You look like you just saw a ghost. You good? My kid is up on the northern ridge with my parents, I said, staring at the dead phone screen. The eye of the storm just tracked right over them. I can't get through to their line. Harris frowned, looking at his tactical radar tablet. The northern ridge? Man, that area is getting slammed with 70-mile-per-hour gusts right now. The terrain up there causes severe runoff. But hey, your folks live in that big estate, right? That place is built like a fortress. They're probably just asleep with the storm shutters down. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But that military instinct, that quiet voice that tells you when an ambush is waiting, was screaming at me. I couldn't shake the image of my daughter's face when I left her. I'll be brave, Mommy. I tried calling one more time. This time the call actually connected, but it didn't ring. It went straight to a live line, and what I heard made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't my mother's voice, and it wasn't my father's. It was the sound of howling, deafening wind. It was the sound of heavy rain slamming against a microphone. And then through the static, I heard a faint, terrified cry. Mommy? Mommy, where are you? It's cold. It was Lily. The call cut out completely. The screen went black. I stood up so fast my chair flipped backward onto the concrete floor of the staging area. My heart wasn't just pounding. It was hammering against my ribs. That wasn't the sound of a child safe inside a warm, protected brick house. That was the sound of a child outside. In the middle of a historic storm. In the dark. Harris, I barked, my voice completely changing. The tired mother vanished, and the battle-hardened sergeant took over. Give me the real-time satellite overlay of Sector 7. Right now. Harris saw the look in my eyes and didn't ask questions. He immediately tapped his screen, bringing up a thermal and radar map of the northern ridge. What am I looking for, Sarge? My parents' coordinates, I said, reading off the GPS location from memory. The map zoomed in, showing the heat signatures and structural integrity of the area. As the image resolved, Harris let out a sharp breath. Oh no. Maya, look at the structural heat map. The main house is fully lit, completely heated. But look at the perimeter. I looked at the screen. The main house was a bright orange glow, indicating maximum heating and electricity. But about a quarter-mile away, near the edge of the dense woods on their property, there was a tiny faint blue dot moving through the freezing dark. A single human heat signature, completely exposed to the elements, moving slowly, erratically. That's my daughter, I whispered, the world tilting around me. They put her out. They threw her out in the storm. Anger, pure, blinding, catastrophic anger, washed over me, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating focus. My parents had done something unforgivable. I didn't know why, and I didn't care about their reasons. All I knew was that my 8-year-old child was freezing alone and terrified in a dark forest during a natural disaster, while her grandparents sat inside a warm, glowing mansion. They thought they were safe. They thought the storm would hide their cruelty, or that they could make up some excuse later. But they forgot what I was capable of. They forgot that I don't need a paved road, I don't need permission, and I don't give up. I grabbed my tactical vest, strapped my survival knife to my chest, and reached for the keys to the heavy-duty, all-terrain military Humvee parked in the bay. Maya, wait. Harris shouted, stepping in front of me. You can't go out there alone. That area is a red zone. The roads are completely washed out, and the command hasn't authorized a rescue team for that sector yet. You'll be court-martialed for taking that vehicle. I looked Harris dead in the eye, and the sheer intensity of my gaze made him take a step back. Harris, my daughter is dying out there. If anyone tries to stop me from getting to her, A court-martial will be the least of their worries. Are you going to help me? Or are you going to get out of my way? Harris stared at me for 2 seconds, swallowed hard, and then grabbed his own tactical jacket. I'm driving, he said. Let's go get your girl. The drive toward the northern ridge was a descent into a living nightmare. The Humvee's massive tires tore through flooded ditches and climbed over shattered tree branches, but even the military vehicle was being pushed to its absolute limits. The windshield wipers were useless against the wall of water hitting the glass. Harris held the steering wheel with a white-knuckled grip, swearing under his breath as he navigated around a mudslide that had blocked half the main highway. We have to take the back trails, I said, my voice eerily calm. When a crisis hits, my military training completely overrides my emotions. Panic is a luxury I couldn't afford. Panic kills. I had a topographical map of the area pulled up on my handheld device, tracing the old logging roads that bypassed the flooded main bridges. Turn left at the next marker. It's an unpaved ridge road. It's going to be rough, but it's our only shot at reaching the property before the valley completely fills with water. Harris yanked the wheel, and the Humvee plunged into the darkness of the forest trail. The branches of the overgrown trees slapped against the armored sides of the vehicle like skeletal hands. The mud below us was deep and thick, threatening to swallow the vehicle whole. But the heavy diesel engine roared, fighting for traction. Every second felt like an eternity. In my mind, I was calculating timelines. Hypothermia in an 8-year-old child exposed to 50-degree rain, and high winds can set in within an hour. If she was soaked to the bone, her core temperature was dropping fast. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It had been 40 minutes since that broken phone call. 40 minutes of my little girl wandering in the dark, wondering why her family had abandoned her, wondering if her mommy was ever coming back. A dark, dangerous rage was simmering deep in my chest, but I pushed it down, locking it away. I needed that energy for the rescue. I needed to be sharp. We're entering the property line, Harris announced 20 minutes later, his voice tense. Through the trees, the massive silhouette of my parents' estate appeared. It looked like a castle in the dark, completely unaffected by the chaos around it. Every single window was glowing with warm, bright light. The massive backup generator on the side of the house was humming loudly, a symbol of their absolute comfort and safety. Stop here, I ordered as we reached the edge of the long gravel driveway. Aren't we going to the front door? Harris asked, his foot hovering over the brake. No, I said, checking my tactical flashlight and drawing my heavy survival knife to clear any brush. The satellite showed her heat signature near the southern woods, close to the old detached guest cabin. If we go to the house first, we lose time. We find Lily first. Then I deal with them. I threw the Humvee door open and stepped out into the fury of the storm. The wind instantly tried to knock me off my feet, and the freezing rain blinded me, but I lowered my head and moved with deliberate, practiced speed. Harris followed close behind, carrying a medical kit and a thermal imaging scope. We plunged into the dense woods. The ground was a swamp of mud, slippery leaves, and hidden rocks. I used my flashlight, sweeping the beam through the thick brush, calling out her name over the roar of the wind. Lily! Lily, it's Mommy! Can you hear me? My voice was swallowed by the storm. We walked for 10 agonizing minutes, tearing through briars and climbing over fallen logs. The thermal scope was having trouble due to the dense canopy and the sheer volume of water falling from the sky. Maya! Over here! Harris suddenly yelled, pointing his flashlight toward a massive, hollowed-out oak tree near the edge of a steep ravine. I sprinted forward, my boots sinking deep into the mud. I rounded the trunk of the tree, and my heart shattered into a million pieces. There, curled up in a tiny, shivering ball inside the partial shelter of the hollow tree trunk, was my daughter. She was soaked to the skin. Her yellow raincoat was torn. Her hands were scraped and bleeding, and she was clutching her soaked stuffed bear, Barnaby, against her chest. Her lips were blue, her entire body shaking so violently that her teeth were chattering audibly. She had her eyes closed, whimpering softly. Lily! I cried out, dropping to my knees in the mud and pulling her instantly into my arms. She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze unfocused, but as she recognized my face through the rain, a tiny, weak sob escaped her lips. Mommy? You found me. Grandpa. Grandpa said you weren't coming back. He told me to leave. Hearing those words, a terrifying silence took over my mind. My own father had told an 8-year-old child that her mother was never coming back, and had forced her out into a deadly storm. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, malicious act of cruelty. They had used the storm as an opportunity to rid themselves of the child they never wanted to care for, the child of the daughter who had defied them. I'm here, baby. Mommy is here. I'm never leaving you, I whispered, wrapping my heavy, dry tactical jacket around her small shivering body. Harris stepped up immediately, opening a thermal space blanket and wrapping it over my jacket, then checking her pulse. Her pulse is weak, Maya, but she's conscious. We caught it just in time. The jacket and the space blanket will start trapping her body heat, but we need to get her into a warm environment immediately. The Humvee's heater is blasting, let's get her back. I lifted Lily into my arms. She felt so incredibly light, so fragile. The military training in me didn't just give me the skills to find her. It gave me the physical strength to carry her through a treacherous swamp without stumbling once. I marched through the woods, holding my daughter tight against my chest, sheltering her from the wind with my own body. We reached the Humvee, and I gently placed her into the passenger seat, wrapping her in another dry blanket Harris provided. I turned the vents, directing the maximum heat directly onto her. Within minutes, the color began to slowly return to her cheeks, and her breathing stabilized. She held my hand with her tiny, cold fingers, refusing to let go. Stay with her, Harris, I said, my voice dead, completely devoid of any human emotion. I stepped back out of the vehicle. Maya, where are you going? Harris asked, looking at me with genuine concern. He knew that tone. It was the tone a commander uses right before an assault. I looked up at the warm, glowing mansion at the top of the hill. I'm going to find out why my parents thought they could get away with this, I said quietly. And then, I'm going to show them what happens when you cross a soldier. The walk up the grand gravel driveway toward my parents' house felt completely different this time. The panic was gone. The fear was gone. My daughter was safe, warm, and protected by a trusted comrade in an armored vehicle. Now there was only the mission. And the mission was accountability. I didn't knock on the massive, heavy oak front door. I lifted my right combat boot and kicked it with the full force of my body, striking it directly next to the lock mechanism. The heavy wood splintered with a deafening crack, and the door flew open, slamming against the interior wall of the grand foyer. The sound echoed through the massive house like a gunshot. Within seconds, my father, Richard, appeared at the top of the grand curved staircase. He was wearing a silk bathrobe, holding a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, looking completely relaxed. But as he saw me standing in his entryway, drenched in mud and rain, his eyes widened in absolute shock. The glass in his hand trembled slightly. Maya, he shouted, his voice a mix of anger and sudden fear. What on earth are you doing? You just destroyed my front door. Have you lost your mind? My mother, Eleanor, emerged from the living room, holding a book, her face turning pale as she looked at me. Maya? How are you here? You're supposed to be on emergency deployment. The roads are closed. I didn't say a word. I walked forward, my muddy boots leaving heavy, dark tracks across their pristine, white marble floor. Each step was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly silent. I stopped at the base of the staircase, looking up at the two people who had brought me into this world. The two people who had just tried to destroy my daughter. Where is Lily? I asked, my voice a low, dangerous whisper that carried more weight than a scream. My mother swallowed hard, glancing at my father before putting on her usual mask of arrogant superiority. She wandered off, Maya. It was a terrible accident. We were adjusting the generator, and she must have opened the back door and run out into the woods. We were just about to call the authorities when the phone lines went down. It's an absolute tragedy, but frankly, if you had trained her better. Stop lying, I interrupted, cutting her off like a blade. I found her, Eleanor. I found her a quarter-mile deep in the woods, freezing to death in a hollow tree. And do you know what she told me? She told me that Grandpa told her I was never coming back. She told me that Grandpa forced her out into the storm. My father's face shifted from shock to a defensive, ugly sneer. He walked down the stairs, trying to use his height and his wealth to intimidate me. just like he had done my entire life. He stopped a few steps above me, glaring down. "Listen to me, you ungrateful girl," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "We did not ask for that child to be dumped on our doorstep. We are elderly people. We have a status in this community. We are not your free childcare while you go off to play soldier in the mud." She was crying, she was making a mess. She was ruining our evening. "I told her to go outside and look for you if she missed you so much. It isn't my fault she was stupid enough to wander into the woods." Hearing him call my sweet, innocent 8-year-old daughter stupid for surviving his cruelty was the final straw. The air in the room felt like it dropped 20 degrees. I stepped up, closing the distance between us instantly. Before he could react, I reached out, grabbed the collar of his expensive silk bathrobe, and yanked him down the last 3 steps, slamming him against the hard marble wall of the foyer. The glass of scotch flew from his hand, shattering across the floor. "Richard!" My mother shrieked, clutching her face in horror. "Stop it. You're assaulting your own father." I pinned him to the wall with one hand, my forearm pressed firmly against his chest. My face was inches from his. He was gasping for air, the arrogance completely draining from his eyes, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He looked into my eyes and realized, for the first time in his life, that he wasn't dealing with his quiet, compliant little daughter anymore. He was dealing with a highly trained tactical operative who had seen the worst of humanity and knew exactly how to dismantle it. "You listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice dangerously calm, vibrating with a cold rage. "You are not a father. You are a coward. You threw an 8-year-old child out into a historic storm because she was an inconvenience to your perfect, selfish life. You thought the storm would cover your tracks. You thought no one would find out. But you forgot who I am. You forgot what the military taught me. I track targets for a living. I survive in environments that would break you in 5 minutes. Maya, please." My father whimpered, his voice cracking, his face turning red. "It was a mistake. We didn't think she'd go that far." "You didn't think at all," I said, leaning in closer. "You thought you were above the law because of your money and your big house. But out here, in this storm, your money means nothing. Your house means nothing. You crossed the ultimate line. You hurt my daughter. And now, you are going to pay the price for it." I released him, pushing him back onto the marble floor. He collapsed into a heap, coughing and rubbing his chest, staring up at me with terrified eyes. My mother ran down the stairs, kneeling next to him, trembling as she looked at me like I was a monster. "What are you going to do to us?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Are you going to hurt us?" I looked down at them with absolute disgust. "Hurt you? No. That would be too easy. That would be doing what people like you do. I am a soldier. I believe in justice. I believe in order. And I am going to use every single resource, every piece of training, and every legal avenue I possess to systematically dismantle your entire life. You think you have status in this town? Enjoy it tonight. Because tomorrow, the entire world is going to know exactly what kind of monsters live in this mansion." I turned my back on them and walked out into the rain, leaving them shivering in their warm, pristine foyer with a shattered door and a shattered future. The next 48 hours were a blur of intense, tactical execution. But I wasn't fighting an enemy combatant in a foreign land. I was executing a precise, legal, and social campaign against my own parents. My military training had taught me that brute force is rarely the most effective way to win a war. True victory comes from strategy, intelligence gathering, and striking your opponent where they are most vulnerable. And for Richard and Eleanor, their vulnerability was their reputation. Their wealth, their social standing, and their standing in the community were the only things they cared about. So, that was exactly what I chose to target. First, I ensured Lily's safety. After leaving my parents' house that night, Harris and I drove straight to the military base's medical facility, which was fully operational and out of the flood zone. The doctors examined Lily thoroughly. Thanks to our quick response, she only suffered from mild hypothermia and a few superficial scrapes. They gave her warm fluids, treated her hands, and wrapped her in comfortable blankets. As she drifted off to a safe, peaceful sleep, clutching Barnaby the bear, I sat by her bedside with my laptop. The rage inside me hadn't faded. It had simply turned into a cold, calculated plan. I called my commanding officer, Captain Vance. I explained the entire situation, omitting nothing. I expected a reprimand for taking the Humvee without authorization. But Vance was a family man and a leader who respected honor above all else. Sergeant Miller, Vance said, his voice heavy over the line. You did what any good soldier and any good mother would do. The Humvee is safe, your daughter is safe, and that's all that matters. As for your parents, that is an absolute disgrace. You have my full backing. If you need time to handle this legally, you have emergency leave starting right now. Keep your head down and handle your business. Thank you, sir, I said. I intend to. With my leave secured, I went to work. I contacted an old friend from my early days in the service, a man named Marcus who now ran a high-end digital forensics firm. I provided him with the satellite data Harris had pulled, the recording of the brief phone call where Lily's terrified voice was captured over the storm, and the medical reports from the military hospital detailing her hypothermia and injuries. Maya, this is heavy stuff, Marcus said, reviewing the files from his office downtown. The satellite heat map clearly shows the main house fully heated and active, while a child-sized heat signature is pushed out the back door and forced toward the woods. Combined with the audio recording and the medical timeline, this isn't just negligence. This is a deliberate act of endangerment. Any judge in the state will see this for what it is. I don't just want a legal case, Marcus, I said, my voice steady. I want their cover completely stripped away. They've spent 40 years pretending to be pillars of the community, while abusing and controlling everyone behind closed doors. I want the truth exposed. Consider it done, Marcus replied. I'll compile this into an unassailable digital evidence package. It'll be ready for the authorities and the media by tomorrow morning. While Marcus worked on the evidence, I took the next tactical step. My father was the chairman of the board for a major regional charity organization and a senior partner at a prestigious local investment firm. My mother was the head of the town's Historical Preservation Society and a prominent figure in high society social circles. Their entire identity was wrapped up in these titles. I drafted a formal, detailed affidavit outlining the events of that night. I attached the medical records and the photographic evidence of Lily's injuries. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't use emotional language. I wrote it exactly like a military after-action report. Dry, factual, and devastatingly precise. When you present facts without emotion, they become undeniable. The storm finally broke on Thursday morning, leaving the town battered but recovering. As the floodwaters began to recede, my parents truly believed the danger had passed. They assumed that because I was a soldier, I would be forced to return to my duties, and that they could eventually sweep the incident under the rug with a team of expensive lawyers. They had no idea that the real storm was just beginning, and this time, it was hitting them directly. I arrived at the local police precinct at 9 a.m. I didn't go alone. I went with Marcus, a prominent family law attorney, and the complete evidence package. The chief of police, an old associate of my father's who often attended the same charity galas, looked uncomfortable as we walked into his office. Maya, the chief said, leaning back in his leather chair. I heard there was some tension at your parents' estate during the storm. Richard called me complaining about a damaged door. Look, families have disputes during stressful times. Chief, I interrupted, placing the heavy digital folder on his desk with a loud thud. This isn't a family dispute. This is child endangerment, criminal negligence, and intentional malice. Before you say another word to defend Richard Miller, I suggest you open that file and look at the evidence. Because if this precinct tries to protect him, this entire package goes directly to the federal authorities and the state media networks. I'm a sergeant in the United States Army, and I will not allow a cover-up. The chief's expression changed instantly. He saw the discipline in my posture, the unyielding look in my eyes, and the sheer volume of evidence before him. He pulled the folder toward him, opened it, and began to read. As he looked at the satellite images of an 8-year-old girl wandering in the freezing dark while my parents sat in a glowing mansion, his face went completely pale. My God, the chief whispered, looking up at me. They actually put her out? Yes, I said. And now, I want them held accountable. The wheels of justice can move slowly, but when backed by military precision and undeniable evidence, they can also strike like a lightning bolt. By Thursday afternoon, the evidence package had been officially processed, and a judge had signed off on arrest warrants for Richard and Eleanor Miller. But I knew that a simple arrest wouldn't be the end of it. People with wealth and influence often find ways to post bail, hire high-priced public relations firms, and control the narrative before a trial even begins. I wasn't going to give them that chance. I utilized the final phase of my strategy: total transparency. Marcus had successfully coordinated with a reputable investigative journalist from the largest state news network. The journalist, a woman named Sarah who specialized in exposing corporate and political corruption, recognized the gravity of the story immediately. It wasn't just a local news piece. It was a shocking exposure of systemic cruelty disguised as high society perfection. The contrast is what's going to break them, Maya, Sarah told me during a secure video call. On one hand, you have a decorated military sergeant out saving lives in a natural disaster. On the other hand, you have her wealthy parents throwing her young daughter into that very same storm out of sheer spite. The public outcry is going to be massive. Their firms, their charities, their social clubs. No one will be able to associate with them without destroying their own reputation. Good, I said. That's exactly what they deserve. The news segment was scheduled to air on the Thursday evening broadcast, right as the town was settling in to watch the storm recovery updates. Meanwhile, my parents were completely oblivious to what was coming. From what my contacts told me, my father had already hired a contractor to repair the front door of the mansion, and my mother had spent the afternoon calling her friends, spinning a narrative about how unstable and aggressive I had become due to my time in the military. They were trying to build their defense by tearing me down, playing the victims of a crazed, ungrateful daughter. It was the same tactic they had used against me my entire life. Whenever I achieved something or tried to stand on my own feet, they would find a way to manipulate the story to make themselves look like the long-suffering martyrs. But this time, they weren't dealing with a defenseless child. They were dealing with a strategist. At 6 p.m., the local news broadcast began. I sat in the military hospital room with Lily, who was happily coloring in a book, completely safe and warm. I turned on the small television on the wall. The anchor's voice was grave. Good evening. As our community begins the long process of recovery after the historic storm, a shocking story of betrayal and child endangerment has emerged from the Northern Ridge. A local prominent couple is facing serious criminal charges after allegedly abandoning their own 8-year-old granddaughter in the height of the storm. The screen flashed to Sarah's investigative report. They played the audio recording, Lily's tiny, terrified voice crying out for me through the howling wind. They showed the satellite thermal imaging, clearly demonstrating the heated mansion contrasted with the freezing dirt moving through the woods. They interviewed the military medical staff who treated Lily for hypothermia. And finally, they showed large, high-definition photographs of Richard and Eleanor Miller, listing their corporate titles and charity affiliations. The impact was instantaneous. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, my phone began to buzz with notifications. My father's investment firm released an immediate public statement, announcing that Richard Miller had been suspended indefinitely from his position as senior partner, effective immediately, pending a full internal investigation into his conduct. The charity organization he chaired followed suit within an hour, removing his name from their website and releasing a statement expressing their deep shock and horror at the allegations. My mother's social world crumbled just as fast. The Historical Preservation Society scheduled an emergency board meeting to vote on her removal. Her elite friends, the people she had spent decades trying to impress, began deleting comments, unfriending her on social media, and ignoring her phone calls. In high society, reputation is everything. Once you become toxic, everyone runs away to save themselves. I received a text message from an unknown number. It was my mother. Maya, what have you done? The text read, "Our lives are ruined. People are standing outside our gates with cameras. The firm has suspended your father. Call this news station and tell them it was a misunderstanding. You are destroying this family." I stared at the screen for a long moment. There was no apology for Lily. There was no remorse for leaving an 8-year-old child to freeze to death in a forest. There was only panic about their lost status, anger about their ruined reputation. Their true nature was fully exposed now. Shallow, selfish, and completely devoid of love. I typed out a short, final response. You destroyed this family the moment you threw my daughter into that storm. You wanted to see what my military training looked like? This is it. I'll see you both in court. I blocked the number. The web was fully tightened. The legal system was ready. The community had turned its back on them. And they were completely trapped inside their massive, lonely fortress. Friday morning arrived, bringing a bright, clear sun that melted away the remaining remnants of the storm. The valley was quiet, but the atmosphere around my parents' estate was electric. The local police department had coordinated the execution of the arrest warrants, and because of the high-profile nature of the case, several news vans were parked along the public road at the edge of the property, their cameras aimed up the long gravel driveway. I chose to be there. I wasn't required to attend the arrest, but as a soldier and a mother, I wanted to witness the final resolution of the operation I had designed. I stood near the police perimeter, wearing my pristine dress uniform. I wanted my parents to see me in the uniform they had despised for so long. The uniform that represented the strength, discipline, and honor they completely lacked. 3 police cruisers drove up the winding driveway, their red and blue lights flashing against the brick facade of the mansion. The chief of police stepped out of the lead vehicle, accompanied by 3 officers. They walked up to the newly repaired front door and knocked loudly. After a long delay, the door opened. My father stood there, looking completely disheveled. The arrogant, wealthy businessman had vanished. He hadn't shaved, his clothes were wrinkled, and his eyes were sunken from a lack of sleep. My mother stood behind him, clutching a handkerchief, her face red from crying. Richard Miller, Eleanor Miller, the chief announced, his voice carrying clearly down the driveway. I have warrants for your arrest on charges of felony child endangerment, criminal negligence, and conspiracy to commit abandonment. Please step outside with your hands visible. This is an outrage. My father shouted weakly, though the bravado was completely gone from his voice. He looked out at the news cameras flashing at the edge of his property, and he looked at the police officers holding handcuffs. We have lawyers. We are going to sue this entire department. You can't do this to us. Step forward, Richard, the chief ordered sternly, not showing a hint of the friendliness he used to display at charity events. Don't make this difficult in front of the press. Officers stepped forward, grabbing my father's arms and pulling them behind his back. The metal handcuffs clicked into place with a sharp, definitive sound. My mother began to weep loudly as an officer secured her wrists as well. They were led down the steps of their grand mansion. Their heads bowed as they tried to avoid the glare of the news cameras. As they were being guided toward the back seats of the police cruisers, my father caught sight of me standing by the perimeter. He stopped, his eyes locking onto my uniform. For a moment, a flash of his old anger returned. You ruined us, Maya. Your own parents. You're a cold, heartless monster. I looked at him from a distance, my posture perfectly straight, my expression completely unreadable. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel sad. I felt a profound sense of relief. I didn't ruin you, Richard, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the crisp morning air. Your own actions did. You threw an innocent child into a storm because you thought you were powerful enough to get away with it. I just showed you that true power belongs to those who protect the innocent. You taught me how to be tough, but the army taught me how to be honorable. Goodbye. The officers pushed them gently into the back of the cruisers, the doors slammed shut, and the vehicles drove down the driveway, their sirens silent but their lights casting a long, symbolic shadow over the estate. The crowd of reporters began to disperse, rushing to file their breaking news reports. Harris, who had been standing next to me the entire time, put a supportive hand on my shoulder. You handled that perfectly, Sarge. A textbook operation. They never stood a chance. It wasn't an operation, Harris, I said softly, looking up at the now empty mansion. It was just a mother doing her job. What happens to the house now? He asked. It'll be sold, I said. The legal fees, the fines, and the civil suit I'm filing on behalf of Lily's Medical Trust will ensure they never hold on to this place. This house was built on a foundation of control and cruelty. It's time for it to go. I turned away from the property, entering my truck. The mission was complete. The threat had been neutralized. Now it was time to focus on the only thing that truly mattered: healing. 2 months had passed since that fateful, terrifying night in the storm. The seasons had changed and the cold, destructive rains of the storm had given way to the warm, vibrant colors of a late spring. The town had fully rebuilt its damaged infrastructure, and life had returned to a peaceful, quiet rhythm. For Lily and me, life had transformed in ways we never could have imagined. We had moved away from that small town, closer to the military base where my permanent station was located. We lived in a cozy, sunlit house with a large backyard filled with wildflowers and an old wooden swing set. There were no grand marble pillars, no isolated woods, and no heavy gates. It was a home built on laughter, safety, and unconditional love. Lily was doing incredibly well. Children possess a remarkable resilience when they are surrounded by the right support. With the help of a wonderful family counselor and a lot of patience, she had processed the trauma of that night. She no longer had nightmares about the rain. In fact, she loved playing in the backyard during light spring showers, jumping in puddles with her yellow boots, knowing that her mommy was always sitting on the porch, watching over her. My parents' trial had moved forward with surprising speed. Faced with the overwhelming digital and physical evidence we had compiled, their high-priced attorneys quickly realized that a defense was impossible. To avoid a long, drawn-out public trial that would continue to expose their history, Richard and Eleanor pled guilty to reduced charges of criminal child endangerment. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who expressed absolute disgust for their actions, sentenced them both to a significant period of community service, heavy financial restitution, and a strict permanent restraining order that legally forbade them from ever coming within 500 feet of Lily or me. Furthermore, the public exposure had permanently shattered their financial and social life. They were forced to liquidate the grand estate to pay for the legal judgments, moving into a small, nondescript apartment in a different city where no one knew their names, completely isolated from the high society world they had spent their lives building. They had sought to isolate my daughter, and in the end, they found themselves completely isolated from the world. One Saturday afternoon, I was sitting on the back porch, watching Lily run through the grass with her stuffed bear, Barnaby, tucked securely under her arm. She was laughing, her face bright and full of life, completely untouched by the shadow of her grandparents' cruelty. Harris drove up the driveway, stepping out of his car with a box of pizza and a bright smile. He had become a close family friend, an uncle figure to Lily, and a constant reminder of the brotherhood and loyalty that exists within the military family. "Hey Lily," Harris called out, throwing a small foam football toward her. "Catch." Lily dropped her bear, caught the football with a wide grin, and ran over to give him a high five. "Look how fast I am, Uncle Harris." "You're lightning fast, kiddo," Harris laughed, walking up the porch steps and handing me the pizza box. "How's everything going, Maya?" "It's going perfectly," I said, looking out at my daughter. "For the first time in my life, the air feels clear." "You did a good thing, you know," Harris said quietly, leaning against the porch railing. "A lot of people would have broken down under that kind of pressure. You used your training to save your girl, and you used your head to get justice. That's rare. The military teaches us how to fight enemies, Harris," I reflected, taking a sip of water. But it took this experience to realize that the most important battles we fight aren't on a map or a battlefield. They are the battles we fight to protect our boundaries, to protect our children, and to stand up against the people who are supposed to love us but choose to hurt us instead. I looked down at my hands, the calluses from years of service still visible. My parents had spent my entire youth trying to make me feel small, trying to break my spirit so that I would remain under their control. They thought that by joining the army, I was running away. They never understood that I wasn't running away from them. I was running toward the person I was always meant to become. The discipline, the tactical focus, and the unwavering commitment to honor that I learned in uniform weren't just skills for war. They were the very tools that allowed me to break the cycle of abuse, to rescue my daughter from the darkness, and to build a fortress of peace around our lives. As the sun began to set over our new home, casting a warm, golden glow across the yard, Lily ran up the porch steps, exhausted but smiling from ear to ear. She climbed into my lap, leaning her head against my chest. "Mommy," she whispered, her eyes growing heavy as the twilight settled in. "Yes, baby?" I asked, stroking her soft hair. "I'm glad you're a soldier," she said softly, clutching Barnaby close. "Because soldiers always know how to find you when you're lost." I held her a little tighter, looking out at the horizon. The storm had come and gone, and though it had torn down the old, fragile structures of my past, it had cleared the way for a beautiful, unbreakable future. We were safe. We were whole. And we had won. The story of what happened on the Northern Ridge didn't just stay within the boundaries of our small town, or the local news networks. In the months that followed the sentencing, it created a massive ripple effect throughout the entire region, serving as a powerful case study in corporate accountability and the true meaning of honor. When a prominent figure like Richard Miller falls from grace, it leaves a massive vacuum. The investment firm he had spent decades building faced severe scrutiny from its clients. People began to realize that a man who could treat his own granddaughter with such calculated cruelty could not be trusted with their life savings, their businesses, or their futures. A massive wave of withdrawals hit the firm, forcing the remaining partners to completely rebrand the company and implement strict ethical oversight committees. It was a stark reminder to the corporate world that wealth without character is nothing more than a hollow shell. The charity organization also underwent a massive transformation. The new board of directors reached out to me, offering a formal apology for ever allowing a man like my father to lead their organization. They established a new emergency fund in Lily's name, dedicated specifically to providing temporary shelter, clothing, and medical care for children displaced by natural disasters and family crises. One morning, I received an invitation to speak at the opening of the new community shelter that the fund had helped build. I was hesitant at first. I am a soldier. I prefer to do my work in the shadows, without accolades or public attention. But Captain Vance encouraged me to go. "Sergeant Miller," Vance said during our weekly briefing, "your story isn't just about a personal victory. It's an inspiration to every young woman and every parent in this community. It shows that uniform stands for something greater than just tactical operations. It stands for the defense of the vulnerable. Go out there and show them what an American soldier looks like." On the day of the event, the auditorium was packed with local residents, military personnel, and volunteers. I stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. Lily was sitting in the front row, wearing a neat little blue dress, her face shining with pride as she watched her mommy. I didn't talk about the tactical details of the rescue, and I didn't focus on the bitterness of my parents' betrayal. Instead, I spoke about the true definition of strength. For a long time, I believed that strength was about enduring pain in silence. I said, my voice resonating clearly through the microphone. I believed that to be strong, you had to accept the cruelty of others, especially if those others were your family. But my time in the military taught me a different lesson. True strength is not about endurance. It is about boundaries. It is about having the courage to look at a toxic, abusive situation and say, no further. This line cannot be crossed. The crowd was completely silent, listening to every word. When we wear a uniform, we take an oath to protect our country against all threats, foreign and domestic, I continued, looking directly at my daughter. But the most important threats we must face are often the ones closest to home. The ones that hide behind wealth, status, and respectable titles. Do not be afraid to expose the truth. Do not be afraid to use your skills, your education, and your inner strength to defend those who cannot defend themselves. Because justice isn't something that just happens. It is something we must actively build, day by day, with honor and determination. As I stepped down from the podium, the auditorium erupted into a standing ovation. But the loudest cheers came from the front row, where my little girl was clapping her hands with pure, unadulterated joy. As we walked out of the building together, holding hands, Harris met us near the entrance, holding a small bouquet of flowers for Lily. Great speech, Maya. You hit it right out of the park. Thanks, Harris, I said, offering a genuine smile. I just wanted to make sure people understood the real lesson here. And what lesson is that? He asked. That a uniform doesn't make you a hero, I said, looking down at Lily. It's the choices you make when the storm hits that define who you truly are. The years began to pass, and the memory of that terrifying night on the Northern Ridge slowly faded into a distant chapter of our history. It was no longer a source of pain or anger. It had become a foundational milestone, the moment our family broke free from the chains of the past and claimed our own destiny. Lily grew from a bright, resilient little girl into a confident, independent young woman. She possessed her mother's sharp mind, discipline, and absolute refusal to back down from a challenge. But she also retained her own unique kindness, a deep empathy for others that had never been broken by the cruelty she experienced in her youth. When she turned 18, she stood in our living room, holding a letter in her hand, her eyes shining with excitement. I was sitting on the sofa, watching her, a familiar feeling of pride and anticipation swelling in my chest. "Mommy," Lily said, her voice steady and full of purpose. "The letter arrived." "And?" I asked, leaning forward. She opened the envelope, pulling out a crisp, white paper with the official seal of the United States Military Academy at West Point. She read the lines quickly, a massive smile breaking across her face. "I got in, Mom. I received the appointment. I'm going to become an officer." I stood up, walking over to her, and pulled her into a tight, emotional hug. Tears of joy welled in my eyes, but I wiped them away quickly, maintaining the composure of a proud mother and a veteran sergeant. "I am so incredibly proud of you, Lily," I whispered. "You worked so hard for this." "I wanted to follow in your footsteps, Mom," Lily said, looking into my eyes with absolute sincerity. "Not just because of the uniform, but because of what you showed me when I was 8 years old. You showed me that a soldier's true mission is to bring light into the darkest storms. I want to be that light for other people, just like you were for me." That evening, we celebrated her achievement with a quiet dinner in our backyard. Harris, now a retired master sergeant, joined us, raising his glass in a toast to the next generation of leadership. The air was warm, the sky filled with a beautiful tapestry of stars, completely peaceful. As Lily and Harris talked about the challenges of basic training and the academic rigors of West Point, I walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the quiet garden. My thoughts drifted back, for one brief moment, to my parents, Richard and Eleanor. I hadn't seen or spoken to them in a decade. I had recently heard through an old acquaintance that my father had passed away quietly in a small nursing home, completely forgotten by the corporate and social circles he had once dominated. My mother lived a lonely, isolated life in a distant city, her name a forgotten footnote in our town's history. They had spent their entire lives chasing wealth, status, and control, sacrificing their integrity and their family on the altar of their own egos. And in the end, they were left with nothing but a hollow, empty legacy. But looking back at my daughter, hearing her laugh as she talked about her future service to her country, I realized that true legacy isn't built on brick mansions, corporate titles, or social standing. It is built on love, sacrifice, and the courage to stand up for what is right. My parents had tried to destroy my life, but in doing so, they had forced me to find my own strength. They had forced me to become the warrior my daughter needed. The moral of our story is simple, but it is a lesson that everyone must learn. The people who try to break you often underestimate the very foundation they helped build. Cruelty and malice can create a temporary storm, but honor, discipline, and love will always survive the rain. When you cross the line against the innocent, you don't just invite justice, you awaken the protector inside those who love them. I turned back toward the porch, joining my family under the warm light of the patio. The uniform was in the closet, the medals were on the wall, but the spirit of the soldier would live on forever in the heart of my daughter. The war was over, the victory was absolute, and our horizon was completely bright.